Okay, so next assignment is to paint on the Kippah New York Islanders logo. So the first thing we do is find a logo that we want to use. So apparently we have more than one version of the logo. So I'm going to try to find one that's not too terribly complicated. So let's see what we can find here. So it looks like the majority of them, the one with Long Island in it is the main logo design. Now the question is, do I want to do red or do I want to use orange? And I think I'm gonna go with the red one here. So select the red one. Hit it again to make it its own page. And it looks like this is the logo that we're going with. Okay, so there are several stages that I go through when painting a capote. So the store wants me to use a royal blue capote for the New York Islanders. As you can see here, they specifically want royal blue to be used. Here's my royal blue. What I personally do is I use a styrofoam head stand-in, such as this. And what I do is I take the capote here, put it on the head, and then I take Glade, if you'll excuse all the marks on the box, Glade press and seal, and I take a piece of essentially that brand specific plastic wrap, and I stretch it over the capote. Now, why do I use specifically Glade press and seal? Because that specific kind has just enough adhesive to stick to the capote. Okay, so here you can see the specific brand Glade press and seal plastic wrap has been stretched over the capote. Again, I use that specific kind of plastic wrap because it has just enough adhesive to stick to the capote while still being easily able to be peeled off when everything is over. Now the next step we do is, because this particular logo is a circle design, the next step is I take a thing like this, find a circle that's big enough. Now, this is the only time I will take something that is pre-made. Is it possible to use a ruler to measure out a circle? Yes, but this way is obviously a lot faster. So what I'll do is I'll take one of these, find out which one fits best on the capote, and then I'll take a Sharpie, and it's going to be extremely difficult because the capote itself is a curved surface. It's going to be extremely difficult to get an absolutely 100% perfect circle using a Sharpie. But what we do is we try to simply draw the best that we can. Is it going to be 100% perfect? It might not. But if it isn't, the differences are going to be so small that no one's really going to notice. So when I use the circle template, what I personally like to do is, if you see on the template, there's these red marks. Personally, what I like to do is I like to try to match them up to the, I don't know, if you want to call them spines on the capote. Match the red marks up to the spines in the capote so that the circle template is on the best that it can be. And again, I use a Sharpie. And again, is it going to be 100% perfect? Maybe, maybe not, but I try to be as close as I possibly can. Okay, so there you see the circle. Now, for those of you not familiar, this is what's called masking out the area. So now we got the circle, and I mean, there's several ways of doing this. It really depends on what avenue the person doing it wants to take. This is the way that I personally do it, and I'm just showing this to you because I don't have any secrets as to how I paint capote. Pretty much anyone can do it except for one step, which is what's called freehand copying, and that step not everyone can do. Freehand copying is basically you draw what you see, and not everyone can do that. So now that I got the circle, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out the circle, and I'm most likely going to paint in the entirety of this blue background that we see here. So we got the plastic wrap, we got the circle drawn on. Now I'm going to take the scalpel here and cut out along the black line here. So far we haven't really done anything that's too terribly difficult. Alright, so the masked area has now been cut out. So, I mean, so far this stuff is pretty basic. Just do one layer at a time. So now what we're going to do is, even though I'm essentially, because of the background here, I'm painting blue on blue. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take Jacquard brand paint. I use Jacquard because it goes on easily without much fuss, and specifically the Lumiere, I don't know exactly how you pronounce it, Lumiere, and Pearlescent Blue. Now this stuff is shiny, a little bit shiny when it goes on, so it stands out a little bit more, even when it's blue on blue. Okay, so let's start painting. So again, using Jacquard Lumiere, Pearlescent Blue. And all we're doing at this point is just like painting a picture. We are using paintbrush to apply the paint. Still nothing too fancy. Now what I personally like to do is I personally like to shake up the bottle just like that, set on the cap. And the inside on the cap, a little bit of paint gathers on the cap on the inside so that I don't have to dip all the way into the bottle in order to get to the paint. So, I mean, my personal feeling is I don't use an overly excessive amount of paint when painting on the capote because I don't want too much paint to build up. Because when I first started doing this, I made the mistake of doing that, and the paint took too long to dry, and it was a pain in the butt to wait for all that to dry, when instead what you do is you apply thin layers at a time, and the thin layers dry faster so they can work faster. Okay, so here you can see we did the first initial painting. And this is why we use plastic wrap as a masking area, because plastic wrap is cheap, and as you can see, even if you want to be super clean, when you eventually take the plastic wrap off and you get that nice clean edge, you use the masking so you can in fact paint essentially outside of the lines, so that eventually when you peel it off, you'll get a nice clean edge. So as I mentioned before, I personally don't dip all the way into the bottom of the bottle. What I personally like to do is I like to shake the bottle so that, as you can see here, an amount of paint gathers in the cap, and you simply use that. So in a design like this, as you can see, the masked area is essentially split into 4 quarters. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I paint 1 quarter at a time. Why do I do this? I've found with trial and error that with the Jacquard brand paint, that when you paint 1 quarter at a time, that by the time you get down to here, that the paint dries quick enough that by the time you finish here, this quarter over here is dry enough so that you can then go back in, again, very light coats, very thin coats. They can then go back to the first quarter and put on a second coat. Now, is that pretty quick going from this quarter to that quarter? Yeah, it is. It's maybe if 30 seconds, but again, the paint dries fast enough so that you can put on 2 or even 3 coats within a matter of 1 or 2 minutes. So for now, this is all that we're going to do, because while this paint dries quick enough, in order to do the next coat, which is going to be most likely, if you can see this red ring around the design, first we got to wait for this to dry overnight. And when it dries overnight, then it's most definitely dry enough so that I can then peel off this plastic wrap, and then the next day we'll put on simply more plastic wrap, and we'll set it up so that we can then paint the thin red ring around the perimeter. And that will be the next layer, or the next step of the design. Okay, so took off the masking. As you can see, nice crisp edge. Now the next step we're going to do is we're going to make that red ring around the design. So now what we're going to do is we're going to reapply the plastic wrap in order to make the masking for the red ring. Okay, so we got our plastic wrap reapplied. Now we're going to take the same template that we used to make the first circle, since it's obviously the same size as the first one that we used. And in order to get that thin red ring, we're going to simply eyeball it and essentially take a guess at the next size ring that we're going to use in order to get that thin red ring. Now at this point, even though the design shows one thing, it's honestly entirely up to you how thick or thin you want the ring to actually be. So what I'm going to do is take a Sharpie, trace around the border of the masking that we did in the first place to make the first ring. When doing this, it doesn't have to be fast, just do it nice and slow. Okay, so what I've done is I've essentially traced the outside edge of the masking area. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my circle template and find a slightly smaller circle than the first one I used, so that we can make a masking area to paint in that thin red circle. Okay, so in actuality, after having tried to match up these circles, the next smallest one I've decided that it's really not going to match up that well, to be honest with you. It's going to be a little bit too thin. So this is where drawing and freehand copy comes in. So I'm essentially going to do this by hand, by eye. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, by eye, measure a distance away from this first circle I drew. And just essentially freehand it to draw the second circle. Okay, so I freehanded the second circle. Now, as you can see, it is not a perfect circle, but in this case, it's still going to look good, because no one's going to take a ruler to make sure it's measured out exactly. No one's going to examine it under a microscope to make sure it's a perfect circle. The design is still going to look good. It's still going to look accurate in the end to what that looks like. So, for the purposes of just making it look similar, this will do the trick. Again, no one's going to take this under a microscope to make sure that everything is absolutely perfect. I always try to make it as accurate as I possibly can, while at the same time keeping in mind that whoever ends up buying this, they're not going to take a measuring ruler to make sure that everything is absolutely 100% perfect. Okay, so now that the outer ring has been drawn, again, freehand, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out the masking area. Now what I'm going to do is between this line and that line, I'm going to slice between here and here, because I've discovered through trial and error that cutting that small line makes it a lot easier to peel off the area I'm going to paint than just trying to peel off the circle as a whole. So next step is we cut out the masking area. Okay, so the area has been cut out. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our crimson red, or whatever red fabric paint you personally decide to use, and just like with the first layer, we're going to paint inside the masking area in order to make the red ring. So far we haven't done anything super complicated. Okay, so here we have the red ring painted, and what I personally do again is thin layers. And again, to explain this, if I start here and go in a circle, by the time I come back here, if I do it in thin layers, this is dry enough so that I can immediately do a second or third layer within a minute or within 2 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint 3 thin layers, so that again, by the time I come all the way around, this spot here will be dry from when I first started. So when you're painting that way, if you're doing thin layers, then that's how you get those nice solid colors in there. That doesn't look blotchy, doesn't look, there are no streaks. You get that nice solid flat color in there. Okay, so if you notice, we got our nice solid red color ring. So what we're going to do is we're going to wait for this to dry overnight, and we're going to peel off the plastic wrap, and we should get a nice crisp ring in there. Now the next few steps we're going to do is, if you notice on the logo, we got the lettering NY, but the lettering is on top of what's supposed to be Long Island. So what we're going to do is first we're going to draw in freehand, because there's obviously no template for that. We're going to draw in an approximation of Long Island, and this is where the freehand copying comes in, that you can draw what you see. Now, do you have to make it perfect? No, because when everything's said and done, no one is going to examine them side by side to make sure that every single bump is accurate. So what we're going to do is, next step is we're going to draw Long Island in there. Then after that, what we're going to do is we're going to draw in this NY, because the NY, as you can see, the white goes on top of the red. Then after that, if you can see, the lettering in Islanders goes on top of the white of the hockey stick. So after we paint in this NY part, we're going to paint in Islanders. So, still a few more steps to go. Okay, so now we get that nice, solid red ring. In addition to the, let's see if I can peel this away for you guys. In addition to the little bit of a shiny blue background that we originally painted. So, what do we have now compared to the design? So now we got the blue background, the red ring. So now what we're going to do next is we're going to paint, we'll draw and paint the island of Long Island in here, because that's the next step. Now we're going to freehand this because there's no template to use, and this is where knowing how to freehand copy comes in, because obviously that's an unusual shape. So this is where it depends on your ability to freehand copy something is going to come into play. So you may notice that you get these small bumps right here. So don't worry about that now. What's going to happen is, in the entirety of the design, that maybe when we get to the NY, that's going to cover up those small paint specks right there. If not, then at the very end, what we're going to do is we're going to clean it up. Wherever the paint is essentially being painted outside the lines. Or in this case, for example, what we're going to do is we're going to take some more of this blue and simply paint over that red in order to clean it up. So anyway, next step, yet another layer of this. We're going to stretch it over the Kippah, and we're going to be drawing and painting the Long Island here. So that's the next step. Okay, so as you can see, I got my next layer, or I don't know if you want to call it a layer, but my plastic wrap stretched over the Kippah. Something important to note is when you're stretching the plastic wrap, again, I use Glad Press and Seal because it has just enough adhesive to stick to the Kippah. So when you're putting this on the Kippah, again, it's up to you. You don't have to do exactly what I do. But what I do is I physically stretch the plastic wrap across the Kippah so that what's on there, it's nice and tight. So that's something else important to note, that it's nice and tight, that you're gonna have as few air pockets in here as possible, because when you have the air pockets and you start using the scalpel to cut, in the long run, those air pockets are gonna end up hurting you. Now, do I get air pockets? Yes, I do. What happens when I get the air pockets after I cut is, after I cut and the masking is a little bit loose, all I simply do on the edges of that is I take my thumb, finger, whatever, and I simply press down on the edges to make the area nice and tight again. It's going to happen no matter how careful you are. it's going to happen that sometimes the plastic wrap comes up, and when that happens, just firmly press down on it and just simply do the best that you can. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take your Sharpie, and again, using freehand copy, we're going to draw this Long Island. Now, is it going to be 100% exact? No, it isn't. But no one's going to take a microscope and make sure that bump for bump it's an absolutely perfect copy. How perfect you want to make it is entirely up to you, of how perfect you want to make it and how good your skill is at doing freehand copy. This is your yarmulke or your capote, and honestly it's entirely up to you. So when you're doing freehand copy, what you might end up doing is every half second you might look from here back to this, and essentially your head is going to turn into a swivel where every single second you're looking back and forth constantly to make sure that what you're drawing is what the picture is showing. So it's entirely up to you how perfect you want it to be. Now, when I'm doing this, when I'm drawing, at first, nice and loose. Always nice and loose at first. Does not have to be perfect right off the bat. Just nice and loose. Get the basic shape in there. See, nice and loose, broken up. Get just the basic shape in there. Does not have to be perfect at all. Once you get the basic premise in there, see how it's nice and broken up? It's not perfect, it's not definite. Doesn't have to be. What you want at first is the basic idea of the shape. Once you have the basic idea of the shape where it's going to lay out, then if you want to, you can go back in and make the line darker and make the drawing of Long Island as close to the picture as you want. Okay, so I drew as best I could the Long Island part of the logo. Is it 100% accurate? No, it isn't. Am I worried about that? No. Because no one is going to take a map and go dot by dot to make sure that what I drew is 100% picture perfect accurate to what the logo is. Because that logo is extremely difficult to duplicate unless you just take a Long Island sticker and slap it on there, which I don't do, because everything I do is 100% painted by hand. I do not use stickers at all. So again, is it 100% perfect? No. Am I that concerned about it? No. Because when people look at this, the basic idea that they're going to get is, oh, okay, that's Long Island. That's the idea. So now that we've gotten the Long Island part drawn out, what we're going to do next, just like we did with everything else, is we're going to take a blade and we're going to cut out the area in which we're going to paint. And just like the design, we're going to paint this in red. Okay, so you can see when we peel off the plastic wrap, we get that nice solid red color in there for the Long Island portion of the design. Now, something important to note is that nice solid red, that was not simply one coat. That was actually applying a good 3 or 4 thin layers of paint in order to get that nice solid red. So, the next step is we're going to paint the NY portion, since the NY actually now goes over the shape that looks like Long Island. Now there's actually several different ways you can do this. You can actually completely forego the plastic wrap and try to do it completely freehand, which is difficult because you need a really steady hand and you need to eyeball what you think is straight. I say what you think is straight because after you paint it and you take a straight edge to it, very seldomly is it actually straight. You can, or what I'm going to do, is put yet another layer of plastic wrap onto here, take my Sharpie, and as best as I can, draw the NY portion. You can take a straight edge. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. The problem is that obviously the Kippah is curved. It is not flat. And obviously taking a straight edge to something that's curved is not easy. It is difficult. Personally, what I do in those times that I absolutely need a straight edge is I simply take one of these circle templates, since it's nice and flexible. If you can see how that's all black right there? That's all the times I used it as a straight edge. So if you absolutely want to use a straight edge, use one of these guys. It's nice and flexible, and to the best of your ability, doesn't have to be 100% exact because no one's going to take a microscope to it. Just like that. That's all you got to do. Just do the best you can. Again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take plastic wrap and, doing the best I can, and do the NY portion. And I'll tell you right now, every time I do lettering like that, whether it's part of a special design where the Y also forms a hockey stick, or where I do straight lettering like this, every time that I do it, and every time I put Sharpie to the plastic wrap, honestly, I always think to myself, please let me get this right. Especially when I'm doing it completely freehand without using plastic wrap as masking. Because obviously, when I don't use a plastic wrap, it's a one-shot deal. So every time I do it, I always say, please let me get this right. Because I obviously don't want to mess up and have to clean it up and have to do it all over again. So, next thing we're doing is the NY. Okay, so once again, we have our plastic wrap stretched out across the Kippah. Very important that I say stretched out, because even though this is nice and flat now, you want to avoid little areas like this where there are little air pockets in there. And to avoid the air pockets, you have to physically stretch it out. So what I'm going to do is as I mentioned, use this little guy for straight edging. And again, doesn't have to be exact because no one's going to take a microscope for it. As best as I can to my ability, I'm going to copy the NY portion of the logo. Something else very important to note is while I will be using a straight edge to do it to the best of my ability, initially I'm going to do it nice and loose without a straight edge in order to get the spacing and size right according to what should fall where on the logo. Because if you notice, one corner of the N falls right in there, which is essentially we're in that little spot in the logo. So certain parts of the logo should fall within certain spots on your Kippah. So I'm going to do it nice and loose at first, and if not an approximation, then make sure that the NY, certain parts of the NY fall within certain areas of the shape of Long Island. Okay, so as I said before, first you stay nice and loose for the initial layout. Now if you notice here, nice and loose, because I didn't like how this line looked in relation, where it fell in relation to the actual logo. So this is why we do it nice and loose. So then I redid the line, made it a little bit shorter, made it more in what it looks like on the official logo. And you can see the lines broken up here because we're staying nice and loose before we go in the straight edge. And we're making sure that certain points of the logo line up with certain aspects of what we did earlier. If they don't, it's your Kippah, it's not written in stone that it has to look 100% point for point, dot for dot exact. It is entirely up to you. But I like to make sure it's as on point as humanly possible. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back on the straight edge, make these broken up lines nice and solid. And once we're done with that, just like we did with everything else, we're going to take our knife, we're going to cut out the area, and we're going to start painting. Okay, so the lines are nice and straight. So what we're going to do is now we're going to paint in white. Now, something very important to note here. What I actually do have is, I tried painting Jacquard white color. And the first time I used that, when it dried, I noticed that for whatever reason, even if you're painting on top of other colors, that the the base color, the original color of the Kippah that you're painting on, would actually show through the white. In this case, if I were to use the white, the base color of this Kippah is blue. So no matter how many coats I would paint, the base color of the Kippah would always show through the white. So when I contacted the company, Jacquard, they recommended, if you can see here, super opaque white. So naturally, I tried using that. Now, the problem is, even when I tried using that, the same thing happened. The base color of the Kippah, in this case blue, would end up showing through the painted blue here. It would show through the red and everything else. I know it's probably just an illusion with the eyes, but it didn't look good because I wanted a solid white. I didn't want any other color tint to it. So, through trial and error, what I discovered is that Jacquard makes metallic silver. See here, metallic silver. Now, the reason why I use that in place of white. One, it stands out more. And number two, when the metallic white dries, again, sometimes you need 3 or 4 coats of very thin layers. When the metallic silver dries, one, it pops more. And two, I mean, it really is an extremely good substitute for the color white. It's much more solid, and it just pops a lot better. Now, eventually, the Lumiere brand came out with pearlescent white. Now, you might think, okay, well, there's a white you can use. Well, actually, I discovered that when this white dries, it actually looks very similar to metallic silver. So if you have either metallic silver or pearlescent white, it's honestly very much up to you which one you want to use, because they both dry very close in color to each other. Personally, I'm going to use the silver because, as I mentioned now 3 times, it shows up much better and it pops a lot more. So therefore, what we're going to do now is we're going to paint the metallic silver in place of the white for the actual NY portion of the logo. Okay, so the masking area has been cut out, and we're now ready to paint with that metallic silver. Now the question may come up of, how do I know when I have to replace the blade on this thing? A good answer for that is, if you feel yourself putting a lot of downward pressure on the blade, that's a good indication that it's no longer as sharp as it needs to be and you have to replace it. Now fortunately in craft stores, replacement blades are really not that expensive. What should be happening is you should feel yourself, barely putting any pressure on it to the point where essentially all it's doing is physically resting in your hands without you putting any pressure on it, and it's just gliding along the plastic wrap. If you feel yourself really gouging, really putting a lot of downward pressure in order to cut it out nice and clean, then it's time for you to replace the blade. Okay, so first coat Now, if you can very much notice, it's very much blotchy, and you can see streaks now that I got paint on my finger. You can see streaks going on. Do not freak out over this. It's gonna happen. This is why we paint in very thin layers, because what I discovered through trial and error is with Jacquard, it dries fast enough so that when you start here, at end over here, by the time you're painting down here, up here, even though it only, I mean, truly only takes a few seconds, by the time you finish painting here, by the time you get back up here, within that few seconds, it's already dried enough so that you can go back and paint another coat on top. And when you paint in very thin layers, and like I said, Jacquard paint dries fast enough that you can do this, that each thin layer that dries a little bit, and you go back and do a second coat, a third coat, just like in real painting, each coat that you put on top of each other will dry in that much more of a solid color. So if your first coat's looking like this, where it's blotchy and streaks, again, don't freak out. Just wait till it dries for a few seconds, or if you want to, a few minutes, or it's up to you, even overnight. And just go back and paint more layers on it. The more layers you paint, or more coats you paint, the more solid color it'll dry. Okay, so within a period of, I don't know, 30 seconds, I was able to put 2 or 3 more coats on here, and you can already see it's becoming more solid. Again, thankfully with Jacquard paints, it dries pretty quick, or it dries quick enough that you can paint several coats within a very short amount of time. Just keep on painting very thin layers until you get the color as solid as you want. You have to wait a few minutes, then paint another coat on it. Okay, so as you can see, after actually quite a few very thin layers, we get the nice solid silver in there. If you notice, none of the red of the Long Island shape is showing through. That is a result of quite a number of very thin layers, waiting a few minutes for it to dry, then painting over again, and as I mentioned before, each coat that you paint just makes whatever color you're painting in that much more of a solid color. So now what we do is we wait overnight for it to dry. What we actually can do right away is take off the plastic wrap, but the catch to that is, even if we do, we can't put on the Islanders lettering until this part, the silver part, dries overnight. And the reason for that is because if you put another layer of plastic wrap that eventually you're going to need to draw out the word Islanders, the adhesive is going to stick to the still wet paint, and it's just going to mess. It's going to mess up all of your hard work, and honestly, you don't want the design to suffer because you did something stupid. So, is it annoying to wait overnight for the paint to dry? Yeah, it is. But that's how I do everything hand painted. That's how I make sure the design comes out right. And that's how you get a good hand painted design. Sometimes you can do stuff quickly, other times you need patience and wait overnight for the paint to dry before you can move on. Alright, so we get the NY done. If you get little spots like this, don't worry about it for right now. We're going to take care of that in the cleanup part of the design. So next thing is we're gonna do the word Islanders in here. So again, we're gonna stretch plastic wrap across the Kippah, and There's actually a few different ways you can do the lettering. You can take a straight edge and do it that way. I'm just going to do it freehand because it's a lot faster, and no one is going to take a ruler to it to make sure it's absolutely 100% straight. So in this case, just as long as it looks good. Okay, so what I will be doing is I will be taking the circle templates that I used in order to make this big circle, because the word Islanders is on an arc, or arch. So what I'm going to do is, if you see there's a little bit of space in between the word and the circle, so what I'm going to do is very simple. I'm going to use these circle templates here, try to find just the right arch in order to give the word Islanders just the right amount of curve in there. Okay, so I know I said I was going to find just the right curve in order to make the word Islanders. I decided to simply freehand it because otherwise it was just going to be too much of a pain in the butt. It's not going to be absolutely exact to that, and I'm fine with that because it's going to look good enough and people will get the basic idea of what it's supposed to be. This is also the reason why oftentimes, or most of the time, out of the entire project, doing the lettering is the hardest part and also the most annoying part, because most of the time there is no template for it. You just gotta do it freehand and hope for the best. Okay, so we get a couple of coats of red on there. Now if you notice, the details of the lettering is not in there because I discovered a while ago through trial and error that cutting in all of the details of the lettering, the details are too small and it's more hassle than it's worth. So now what I do is I just paint in the basic shapes, and then later on I go back in with a really thin brush and I paint in all the details. Okay, so we took off the plastic wrap, and as you can see, we now have to paint in the details of the lettering. Now what do I mean about that? So for example, if you can see that S is actually this block. So instead of trying to cut out those tiny details with the scalpel knife, which is a possible yes, because I've done it before, but it is extremely annoying to do all those tiny cuts. And I've discovered that it's easier just to paint it as a block and then go back in with a very thin paintbrush, such as that type of thin paintbrush, and just paint in the details to make that block, which is supposed to be an S, look like that S. So now that's what we're going to do. We're going to do that to each letter that we have to make it look like the letter that's supposed to be. Okay, so we saw the before, and this is the after. It is cleaned up. So now, as you can see, the S looks like an S, the A looks like an A, so on and so forth. Now, with this other S in here, obviously it's not perfect, but at that small of a scale, at least it looks like the basic idea of what an S is supposed to look like. Again, no one's going to take a microscope and go over dot for dot what the logo is supposed to look like. So here's the after. Now the only thing left that we need to add are the four stripes on the hockey stick, because if you notice, it's not there, and the hockey puck. Now the hockey puck, I'm just going to freehand, because one, because I can, and two, because it's going to be a really big waste of time and material if I just put on a coat of plastic wrap just for that one hockey puck. And hopefully after those two things and I clean up the rest of it, like for example that little bit of silver overdoing it right there. Once I do a little bit more cleanup, then it'll look like the logo, and we'll be done. Okay, so now for the hockey puck, what we're gonna do is we're gonna change it up a little bit. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take this Montana brand acrylic silver marker. Instead of killing ourselves using the paintbrush, we're going to do the white portion of the hockey puck, the nice small oval shape. We're going to freehand it with our silver paint marker. Okay, so from start to finish, that is our design. Here's the original. Here is our recreation. Obviously, it's not 100% perfect, but it's close enough. So, the only step that I do now, after the paint dries overnight, is what I do is I add a layer of Scotchgard. Now, why do I spray on Scotchgard? When the paint dries overnight, it's usually good to go, but what Scotchgard does is it's just an added layer of protection against moisture and water. So if you're wearing this and it rains, the idea is that the paint won't run. With that extra layer of Scotchgard on it, it should help repel the water if it whatever water or liquid gets on this. So, with the exception of a layer of Scotchgard, and after you apply the Scotchgard, definitely let it dry overnight. But with the exception of that, that is how you paint a Kippah and how you duplicate a design. So again, that's the original. That is the duplicated version. And that's it. So hope you enjoyed the video.